Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. What values do sages recommend that we adopt? My discussion of that follows in video 27. What values should we teach children? In the previous video, I suggested that we teach them to be open-minded and to think for themselves. Those recommendations, though, are more about procedure, about how to approach questions of value. Obviously, there's a lot of disagreement about values. Just follow the daily news programs for a few weeks to learn about all the current fights, disputes, and wars. However, when it comes to fundamental values, there's not as much disagreement as it may initially appear. One value, call it A, is more fundamental than another value, call it B, if and only if B takes for granted or presupposes A. Suppose, for example, that two political parties in a representative democracy are disagreeing about some proposed agricultural legislation. Yes, there's disagreement there, but it may not be fundamental. It may only be about means. One party predicts that if the bill in dispute is passed and becomes a law that is enforced, the productivity of farms and ranches will increase, whereas the other party thinks it will decrease. That's not a fundamental disagreement because both parties value increased agricultural productivity. They agree fundamentally. However, there remain, of course, fundamental disagreements. What's their source? They result from different conceptions of what it means to be a human being and live a good life. I feel somewhat foolish admitting that it took me several decades to realize that clearly. Most people are extremely reluctant to examine, question, test their most fundamental conceptions of what it means to be a human being or to live a good life. The result is that, although it's possible in some cases simply to agree to disagree, in other cases we wind up bothering and even killing each other. The first step towards any real solution is for us to be willing to step back from all our beliefs in order to examine them. The second step is for us to be willing to examine by direct experience which understandings lead to the most satisfaction and fulfillment. Examining by direct experience means setting aside, temporarily suspending, all assumptions and presuppositions for the duration of the practical examination. Even if non-philosophers would agree to do that, and they won't, there's still the serious problem mentioned in the previous video. That's the problem of the criterion of truth. We've seen how our perceptions rapidly become contaminated by our understandings. We've also seen how perceptions are not a source of knowledge, in the strict sense of knowledge anyway. Since perception is our chief source of information about the world, how should we proceed? How can we tell if a proposition is true? You may feel that there's a lot of urgency about finding our way towards fundamental value agreements. It's not just, for example, the health costs and economic disruption created by the COVID-19 pandemic, but the effects of a rapidly changing climate are also weighing on us. For example, not only is sea level rising, but the seas are becoming warmer and more acidic. That threatens the food chain of the oceans. If the deterioration of just our physical conditions is not rapidly slowed and preferably reversed, the lives of billions of our fellow humans will soon be much worse. That's serious motivation for changing our ways. What should we do? Well, I have two recommendations that I'd like to submit for your consideration. When we think about what to do or to be, we should be emotionally peaceful. Emotions distort clear thinking. The more intense an emotion, the more our focus narrows and we lose perspective. So, my first recommendation is to ensure that you begin practicing daily to free yourself from emotional bondage if you are not already doing it. I've previously explained why that works. Assuming that you understand that, the only question is whether or not you'll do what is required. If you learn a lot about, say, strength training and never do any, your learning will have been a useless waste of time. When you find yourself emotionally stressed in any way, use the peacefulness process, emotional humility, or some other effective reactive method to return to neutral. Every day, do aliveness awareness, zazen, or some similar classic meditative proactive method in order to diminish the chances of unwanted emotions arising in the first place. If you do not do that, your odds of ever living well are slim to none. Period. So, please, for your own sake, as well as for the rest of us, sit proactively for at least 20 or 30 minutes twice daily. My experience is that doing so will change your life for the better in a lasting way. Much more importantly, sages have been recommending daily meditation for literally thousands of years. My second recommendation is to decide to detach, at least temporarily, from your fondest beliefs in order to examine them. You've likely seen that popular quote from Einstein. Quote, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." End quote. Recall the 0 to 1,000 energy scale developed and recommended by David R. Hawkins that I introduced earlier in this series. Compare his power versus force. Every person, even including infants, has an energy or consciousness rating. Naturally, someone whose rating is in the 200s will understand and think quite differently than someone whose rating is in the 400s. When Einstein was talking about the same thinking, he was really talking about the same level of thinking. What may seem not only true but obvious, for example, to someone who rates at 445 may be radically different from, and even perhaps unintelligible to, what someone who rates at 245 understands as true. For example, if it were possible for human beings to agree upon an effective plan for dealing with global warming and act upon it, shouldn't it have already happened? For example, if it were possible for human beings to agree upon an effective plan for dealing with economic injustice and act upon it, shouldn't it have already happened? Do you think that these and other major problems will be satisfactorily addressed as long as we stay stuck on the prevailing common level of thinking? If our prevailing common level of thinking jumped up, do you think that these and other major problems may be satisfactorily addressed? If so, are you willing to jump up a level? It's impossible to stay the same and to improve. I hope that you're willing to be open-minded. In subsequent videos, I discuss not only topics like commonly held myths about emotions, as well as individual emotions such as fear, but I also introduce some ideas that may radically challenge and alter your fundamental understanding. Let's consider one such idea in the next video and relate it to emotional problems. In the video after that, let's consider the values that sages recommend to get us well started. Let's end emotional distress.